Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here on this extremely beautiful spring afternoon to discuss with you migration in the Mediterranean. And I would like to take the opportunity this afternoon to share with you some, I would say, preliminary findings of a research project we did in Morocco. And we did it together with a few other institutes, by IMI Oxford, by IGOT Portugal, and by PRIO in Norway. And it was about migration systems. And I would like to discuss this afternoon the specific migration corridor between Nador and Rabat in Morocco, which is our typically migration sending areas, to Western Europe, and especially to the Netherlands. And I hope it works, yes. And I would like to make an empirical point and a theoretical point. One point is that we witness a declining migration from Morocco to Western Europe, especially to the Netherlands, but partly to a country like Belgium. And the question is why? And secondly, I want to make a kind of theoretical point. Because if you look at the scientific literature on migration, there is a strong emphasis that when migration is taking place, it gets a kind of self-reinforcing character. And what is captured by the notion of Douglas Massey of cumulative causation. When migration starts, it goes on and on and on. It's a self-reinforcing process. And I would like to make the theoretical point that sometimes you see the opposite, that migration stagnates, that it declines. And I would like to, to capture this process with the notion of diminutive causation. So I would like to talk about what I call migration undermining feedback mechanisms. And especially I would like to talk about this corridor between the Netherlands and the areas of Rabat and Nador in Morocco. And to make a more general point, I think what we're witnessing today is part of, I think, a more general paradigm that migration flows, for example, from Turkey and Morocco, these typically gastarbeiters countries, are now in the process of transformation. My second point is that if you study the literature on migration, of course we are always in search of this iron laws migration or more general explanations, but I would like to make the point that to understand specific migration corridors, we need to have a stronger focus on what I call migration mechanisms of the middle range. To understand specific migration patterns, we have to be more precise. And what you witness nowadays in the social sciences is the importance of mechanistic-based explanations. We want to know the nuts and bolts of a specific process, how it really works. I'm not going to discuss it with you this more theoretical part, but another part I think is extremely useful for my argument, that part of this mechanistic approach, which is in a sense a kind of realistic turn to the social sciences, is also the idea that you have to explain macro level phenomena, for example ongoing migration or declining migration, but also referring to micro elements. And I use this what is called the Coleman boat, and I think it's a very useful metaphor when it comes by describing migration processes. And Coleman, the famous sociologist, made the point that very often you see that there is a relationship between specific social facts, social policies, and specific outcomes. And as I said, I'm going to make use of the data we collected in this THEMIS project, and especially I'm going to focus on this corridor between Morocco and the Netherlands. And as I said, we did a study in Nador and in Rabat, two different areas. Secondly, I would like also to say a few words about the migration from Morocco to UK, and as contrasting cases, I would like to say a few words on migration from the Ukraine and Brazil to Western Europe. But the major part will be the migration from Morocco to the Netherlands. And in this slide, it shows, I think, very nicely these two ideas. One is the idea of cumulative causation, which is dominant in the migration literature, especially by the work of Dr. Messi. The idea that you have upward spirals of international migration. And it's because of the inequalities between countries, you see migration takes place, migrants send remittances back home. Because of the remittances they send back home, you see process of relative deprivation. More migrants are willing to move. Because more and more migrants are willing to move, you see the establishment of migrant networks. Because there are migrant networks, it reduces the cost of migration, it facilitates migration, and in the end it generates a kind of culture of migration in descending countries. Now, which is documented, for example, in the North African part, that you have this kind of culture of migration, that people have this strong migration aspirations. But to a certain degree, it's a self-reinforcing, self-amplifying process. And I'm going to make the that you also see the opposite. This is, I think, the challenge of this afternoon. And I'm wondering, maybe, I think also Greece is facing not only this upward spirals of international migration, but also from specific country, partly Greece, downward spirals of migration. To understand what is going on in Europe, and now I take the Dutch as a kind of strategic research site. First, we have to look at what are the institutional changes within Western Europe. This is an example of the Netherlands, and if you want to understand migration patterns and migration flows, you have to understand what is taking place at three institutional levels. One is migration policies, migration management. Secondly, of course, are the opportunities at the labor markets. And thirdly, what you could call societal reception. And societal reception has to do with the societal discourse and also the kind of hospitality towards the reception with respect to migrants. And what you see in the Netherlands is, especially this in the first period, the guest worker period, you saw an extremely receptive migration policies. The Netherlands was willing to attract labor migrants from Morocco, substantial job opportunities, and a rather welcome climate. In the last couple of decades, this has changed substantially, and not only in the Netherlands, also, for example, in the country of Belgium. Migration policies have become more selective and more restrictive when it comes to labor migration, but also when it comes to family migration. Job opportunities has changed, especially when it comes to low-skilled work, but also because of the enlargement of the European Union. You see a displacement of low-skilled workers because of the inflow of labor migrants from Central and Eastern Europe. And thirdly, and I think this is, it's sad to say, but a substantial change in the societal climate with respect to migrants, especially Muslims. And the establishment of populist parties, the Party for Freedom nowadays in the Netherlands, a very powerful a party, and especially when it comes to Muslims. So you see a different societal climate. So if you look at the figures, they are the official figures, indeed you witness a kind of decline when it comes to the immigration from Morocco to the Netherlands. Not only when you look at the official, not only when you look at the irregular migration. I have here a table which will show you the apprehensions of irregular Moroccans. At the Erasmus University, I did a 10-year research which was called The Unknown City about irregular migrants. And in the past, when we studied irregular migration to the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, Moroccans formed one of the largest irregular populations in the Netherlands, which is no longer the case. So only studying the apprehensions, and you have to take into account that the actions to fight irregular migration became more severe, that however you see that the number of apprehensions is strongly in decline. So both, I think both tables show a declining migration, a declining regular migration and a declining the regular migration to the Netherlands. And you know what I would like to show? That because of these institutional changes, you see declining migration. But how does it work? So first, we have to understand how these institutional factors have influenced the habitus and the value system and the motivations of settled migrants to help potential migrants in Morocco. This is the case I'm going to discuss with you. So my point is that these kind of institutional factors have influenced the migrant network substantially. That it has led to what I call actions of gatekeeping and gate closing. What you see nowadays in Western Europe, that established migrant networks are more reluctant to help potential migrants to come over. In the past they were a kind of bridgeheads or pioneers, you know, enabling this chain migration, but now you see these acts, what I call gatekeeping, very selectively helping some people to come over, or closing the gate, pulling up the ladder. And this is the most important argument, it is influencing the migration culture in the sending country. This is the most difficult part, I think, of my argument. Just to illustrate some of the changes, this is an account of a Moroccan man who arrived in Utrecht in the 1960s, and he says, I stayed there for one day, the next day I went to the industrial area in Utrecht, and when I arrived there, everyone was waving to me. In that time you could find work everywhere, there was more than enough work in the 1960s, everyone was waving to me and telling me, come to us, come to us. I went there, they welcomed me, accepted me as an employee, they gave me a chair and put all kinds of stuff in front of me to choose from. Cigarettes, cigars, cookies, in those days they were really happy with us. They immediately gave me a place to stay and I started to work there. This was an account, a little bit romanticized account of the past. Another account, you find more or less the same story. In those days they liked us, we were helped by everyone, people were friendly to us. The migrants were very helpful towards each other, but the Dutch people also really helped the migrants to find their way here. In both neighborhoods in Rotterdam that I lived in, there was a very good atmosphere between migrants, but also between migrants and Dutch people. And now you see, we interviewed more than 400 Moroccans in the city of Rotterdam, and what you see is what they make this point. Firstly, when it comes to this change, this first part, when it comes to this mechanism of changing belief formation. Firstly, they're telling the migration policies have become stricter. They're telling there is no work anymore. Because we also interviewed returned migrants in Nador and Rabat, and some stated, I returned to Morocco, but of course I could not bear live in the Netherlands any longer. I felt that I was treated as a foreigner because I'm not Dutch, I hate racism, I wanted to have some peace of mind. And it's interesting to note, we asked people, do you recommend potential migrants to come to the Netherlands? And almost 80% said no. So this is the first part of my argument. Secondly, when looking at this action formation mechanism, you see these processes of negative feedback. In the past I didn't tell them to stay in Morocco, but now I do. No, what would he do here? The question, would you help someone to come to the Rotterdam? What would he do here? Without work, without papers, what would he do here? Because work contracts are no longer available, so I do refuse this idea of assisting young people to migrate. I would not advise them to migrate. So you see this negative travel advice. This is a very interesting table, because we asked this, the persons in Rotterdam, have you received assistance in the past on 5 domains, with documents, visa, with the travel expenses, with the job, with housing, and if someone took a respondent in in one's own house. And you see that nearly 80% were helped on 2 to 3 domains. We also asked them, are you willing to help people nowadays, yourself? And then nearly 70% say no. So this is a kind of empirical evidence of this process, what I call gatekeeping and gate closing. Now the final arrow. And what we do see is that because of the negative feedback provided by established migrant networks in the Netherlands to potential migrants in Nador and Rabat, something is changing. The mentality has changed in Nador and Rabat. This has changed because the people that have recently migrated constantly tell the people back home how the situation in Europe has deteriorated. And another respondent says, no, they are no longer interested in leaving Morocco. There is a decline of migration due to the scarcity of jobs available. Few people still think about migration because there is no help that they may receive from Moroccan migrants. I'm not going to make the argument that migrant networks explains everything, but you do see this negative feedback, this migration undermining feedback, and it partly influences potential Moroccans in Nador, of potential migrants in Nador and Rabat. Some other quotes, and these quotes show also that in Rabat and Nador things has changed. Economically, people are no longer interested in migration. Some respondents stated people are no longer in going abroad because of changing living standards, more job opportunities in Morocco. And what you see is not that people are not willing to migrate any longer, but that you see changing preference for destination countries. Especially because of the restrictive policies and partly because of the limited job opportunities in Europe, including Italy and Spain. So when you look at our data, you see the higher skilled have a preference for Canada, Australia, and the United States. Lower skilled, still a little bit for Spain and Italy, but then more on a circular basis. So my point is that because of the negative feedback, I take the Dutch as an example, because of this negative feedback through established migrant networks, the migration culture in the Mediterranean is changing. I think I'm going over my time.
No, you have another 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I'm just, what is interesting, I'm not going to discuss this part of the research, but it's extremely interesting because I told you something about what the role of this established, this old-fashioned, you could argue, migration networks. But you also have to take into account the role of the social media and online media. And it shows you how important it is. These are the data from all the countries that participated in our research, but it shows you, that how important, apart from the traditional networks, how important social media is in informing potential migrants. And we do think also that this critical feedback not only works through traditional networks, but also through the social media. And this is in fact my point, that because of this, these specific mechanisms, you see that the migration is declining and a different group is now entering the Netherlands. The more highly skilled who are able to pass these difficult exams to come to the Netherlands, students, the higher skilled who are able to get a work permit. And it's interesting to see that especially this group is more reluctant to offer help, has a more individualized lifestyle. To give you one example from the corridor between Morocco and the UK, we interviewed in the area of London about 180 Moroccans, and we asked them more or less the same, we asked them exactly the same kind of questions, and again, many of them have received support. And when you talk about the migration corridor between Morocco and the UK, you're talking about the migration flow that is characterized by more highly skilled, and you see they are even more critical to support potential migrants. This more higher class of of migrants. Again, an example of gatekeeping and gate closing. So I will skip these other examples and come to the conclusion. First of all, I think, of course, we have to enrich the theoretical model. We should bring in more factors that are related to the sending country. What is happening economically in Morocco? We have seen, especially in the period 2001, 2008, 2009, substantial economic growth, better opportunities for a substantial number of people. Nevertheless, Morocco still faces, a substantial unemployment, and still has this area in which you have a lot of poverty. So there is still enormous pressure to migrate. However, I think to understand what is happening to understand the migration from Morocco to Western Europe, we have to take into account what is happening economically in Morocco, also when it comes to the migration policy, etc., etc. Because, of course, that influences, as I have shown, migration aspiration also. Secondly, and this is also based on work of Professor Berriane from Morocco, you do see that apart from the restrictive policies and apart from the limited job opportunities, also this climate in Western Europe is influencing the migration culture. That's why potential migrants have a preference for new destination countries, like Canada, Australia and the United States. Thirdly, I do think what I try to show to you is this process of cumulative causation, because not of this positive feedback, because of this negative feedback, that it explains this downward spiral of international migration. I discussed with you the case of migration from Morocco to Western Europe, but another example would be Turkey. For more or less the same reasons. There are more economic opportunities in Turkey to stay there, and it is more difficult for them to find a proper place in Western Europe. And again, you also see a kind of declining migration from Turkey, for example, to Germany, but also to other European countries. So, and I do think that studying these kind of specific mechanisms give more insights in the direct and indirect consequences of migration policies. Thank you.